Today, we honor the victims and heroes of 9/11, particularly the souls aboard United Airlines Flight 93. Our guest today is able to tell her story thanks to their bravery. On 9/11/2001, 4 passenger planes were hijacked. 3 hit their targets, but 1 did not, because the passengers and crew aboard that flight attacked the hijackers, and the jet crashed into a Pennsylvania field instead of reaching its likely target, the U.S. Capitol. But did you know that a pair of F-16s were sent on a suicide mission to stop Flight 93? Heather Penney, call sign Lucky, was one of those 2 pilots. A truly remarkable woman. She was later deployed to combat twice, and today she's a senior resident fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and a defense policy advisor. I interviewed Lucky Penney 3 years ago, but whenever I tell people her story, most still haven't heard it. So today we're sharing it with you again. Here's my conversation with Lucky Penney. Heather Penney, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be able to be here with you.
You have one of the most incredible stories that I've heard about 9/11, of which there are so many. And even though you've told it before, I think a lot of people have not heard this story. But before we get into it, maybe just introduce yourself a little bit. What's your family background? How is it that you came to be a fighter pilot, not an everyday profession?
No, being a fighter pilot is not an everyday profession, but fortunately I was raised by a fighter pilot. So my dad was a fighter pilot. I'm a 3rd generation pilot, military pilot. My grandfather was an instructor in World War II. And I grew up knowing that my dad had flown in Vietnam, and he was still actually flying fighters in the Reno Air National Guard, flying F-4s. So I grew up around fighters, and I just loved the jet. It was so fast and big and mean looking, even just sitting still on the ramp. And I loved the brotherhood of the fighter pilots, the squadron. I mean, it was such a great way to be able to grow up that I knew that when I got older, that's what I wanted to be.
How long were you on the force before 9/11?
I was a brand new lieutenant. I had just gone through pilot training, earned my wings. I'd spent a year learning my major weapon system, the F-16. So I had just gotten back from qualifying in the F-16 and had earned my mission qualification status, my combat mission ready status, just that March of 2001.
Wow.
So I was still a new guy.
Let's go to 9/11. Let's start the day. What would a normal day look like for you? What should that day have looked like?
We were actually really low on people in the squadron because we had just gotten back from a major exercise called Red Flag in the Nevada desert. And being in the DC Air National Guard, most of our airmen were part-timers. You know, the National Guard, these are citizen soldiers. So it was a skeleton crew that morning. I was actually not on the flying schedule. I was going to be part of, you know, the small corps. There's like a handful of us there in the squadron that was going to plan out the next month of operations there in the fighter squadron. So I was stuck in meetings all day, or I should have been.
When did you first learn that something was terribly amiss?
I was in a scheduling meeting with the other pilots when one of our enlisted troops, David Callahan, knocks on the door and walks in, and we were kind of surprised. We looked at him, we're like, what are you doing? And he says to us, an aircraft just hit the World Trade Center. And we looked at each other, and we looked outside, and it was a spectacularly glorious blue day. And we thought, well, how does that happen? And we just made the assumption that it was a light general aviation aircraft flying down the Hudson, maybe wasn't paying attention and bounced off a building. That's all we thought. So we went back to work. And it wasn't until the second aircraft hit the second World Trade Center and David Callahan came back and said, second aircraft, it was on purpose. And that's when we got up from our meeting and saw on the television what everyone else saw that morning. And it was clear that our nation was under attack.
What happened next?
Nothing fast enough. You see, we're the DC Air National Guard, and we did not have an alert mission at that moment in our history. Alert, where we had fighters armed with real weapons, real missiles, ready to go at a moment's notice, that all went away after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So our nation had five units guarding our borders. And they were all looking out, they weren't looking in. And we weren't part of that.
So were you the only possible squadron that would be available for action?
Except that we didn't have any weapons. And we didn't have the chain of command. Those alert squadrons, there's a chain of command that allows the nation's leadership to be able to scramble them. They have standing rules of engagement of how they're supposed to intercept and handle threats to our nation. But we didn't have the rules of engagement. We didn't have that chain of command. There was no way that the federal chain of command could have gotten through to us because we're a National Guard unit. The other challenge is that Guard units they belong in civilian times to the governors. This is how our citizen soldiers respond to things like firefighting, floods, hurricanes. They're at the disposal of their governor. But our chain of command went directly to the president. And President Bush was pretty busy at that point in time. And honestly, I don't even know that he would have thought to try to activate us. So getting the authorization to launch and then getting the weapons on board the aircraft were our two biggest problems.
So how are those addressed?
We did have some leadership there in the squadron. We had General David Worley, who was our wing commander, our operations officer, Major Mark Sasseville, now General Mark Sasseville, and we also had our weapons officer, Major Dan Kane, again, also General Dan Kane now. Together, they made decisions about the risk that they could accept and the actions that they could take and what they could not do. So they had Dan Kane, Raisin Kane, call down to our bomb dump where we store all of our weapons and order our troops down there to start building up missiles. People don't realize bombs and missiles, when we store them in the bomb dump, they're not like, you don't pull off the plastic wrap and just load it up. We actually store all the components separately to prevent errors from happening. And so they would have to build up the rocket motor, the fusing, the bomb body, the explosives, the guidance kit. They would have to build all of that up together.
So how long would that take?
Too long. Furthermore, if we had taken off, we didn't know what response was going on with the National Command Authority. We could have made things even more confused than they already were. And importantly, we knew what the target was. Innocent Americans in airliners with terrorists. And that was something that we could not take down of our own accord without the explicit authorization and intent from our national leadership. So we simply had to wait.
Until what?
When the Pentagon was hit was when we finally got the authorization from Vice President Cheney. And the Secret Service knew how to get in touch with us because Air Force One lives and operates out of Andrews Air Force Base. And that's how we finally got the word to launch, the authorization to launch.
So what was the exact order? How was it transmitted to you?
Sass looks at me and says, "Lucky, you're with me." And he looks at Dan Kane, he says, "Raisin, you and Igor, Brandon Rasmussen, you guys wait until you get missiles. All right, Lucky, let's go." And I remember running after him down the hallway and then down the stairs into life support where all of our flight gear is. And remember, I'm a new guy. I'm still brand new. And I'm trying to think, don't screw this up, because if anything I had done in my life mattered, that was it.
But did you understand what was being asked of you? What was the process going on in your mind?
We knew. Sass and I knew. We knew that if we took off and we were mission successful, that we would be ramming our jets into the airliner, that we would not be coming home, that if we were successful, it was a one-way mission. Because we didn't get the missiles in time. And although we did have 105 bullets in each of our jets, so 210 bullets total, they weren't high explosive incendiary rounds. They were just lead nose. They're like, 20 millimeter BB guns. That wasn't going to be enough. Given the stakes, and we had seen the aircraft on the television fly into World Trade Center. We knew what had to be done. There was no question in my mind.
So at this stage, was it known how many other flights were potentially in play?
We didn't know fully how many other aircraft were still airborne. We had heard that the FAA was beginning to ground airliners, but we weren't getting fed any information from the Pentagon. We weren't getting fed any information from the FAA. So our intelligence officer, David McNulty, was literally calling on the phone to airline reservation desks and calling on the phone to air traffic control here at Potomac that controls the airspace around DC to try and account for every single airline flight. And based off of his phone calls, we thought that there were up to 3 airliners still airborne.
So what was the mission exactly? To find any of them, to intercept one in particular? What was your mission?
We knew that there was an airliner coming in from Pennsylvania, and it was low and they'd lost radar contact with it. So they thought that maybe it was coming down the Potomac River, and that was our target. It was only later that we would find out that was Flight 93.
You take off. There's 2 of you. What happened in the air?
When Sass and I took off, we headed to the northwest because we knew that that's where the threat was coming from. We never found anything. We were actually too late to get to Flight 93. The passengers were the real heroes that day. When we finally turned around, when Sass finally said, "Ranch House, we got to get back to DC," we didn't know that Flight 93 had crashed. And the reason why he pulled us back to DC to set up a combat air patrol was because if we had gone too far, then if we had picked the wrong axis to fly down, we could have been flanked by somebody else. By getting back to DC, we could send up a combat air patrol, an orbit, and then basically act as a goalie for any other threats that might come our way. Then Raisin and Igor, Brandon Rasmussen got airborne. They had missiles, and that allowed Sass and me to then land so that we could get missiles on our jet and then take off again, knowing that the airspace was secure. As we began to learn what had happened to Flight 93, what had happened with the Pentagon and the towers, we learned later that they collapsed. That as we began to build the picture of that day is when I began to realize that's what we were going after.
And what were you feeling as you started to put those pieces together?
I felt like a failure. Because those people should never have been in a position where they had to make the decision that they did. We failed them as our nation's military. Our intelligence apparatus failed our nation. There were so many strings of failures that led to that day, but what now as I look back 10, 15, 20 years on September 11th of 2001, it actually gives me hope. Even as divided as our nation is right now, as chaotic and contentious as our public discourse seems to be, what the passengers on 93 did that day gives me hope, because when they got up that morning, they were just going on a business trip or coming home from vacation or going to see their family. They hadn't raised their right hands and given an oath to protect and defend. But that's what they did. That's what they did. The greatest generation, that spirit, isn't gone. It's still alive in each and every one of us. And they proved that. That you don't have to be special or unique to be a hero. And that love of nation, that love of country, that love of our fellow citizen, it shouldn't be bound up in all of the vitriolic anger discourse that we have today. That there's something deeper that connects all of us. And that is what animated them that day. That's what motivated them that day, because they knew that their nation needed them, and they answered the call. And so I am forever grateful that they were ordinary Americans.
It's a remarkable perspective. It's very inspiring and heartbreaking. What about the days immediately after 9/11? What were they like for you?
They were busy because we maintained a 24/7 combat air patrol over DC. And as a matter of fact, the DC Air National Guard owned the cap for DC for the next 2.5 weeks while we worked with the active duty Air Force to hand that authority over and normalize those operations. So it was unprecedented. And to figure out what the rules of engagement would be, how would we control and sanitize the airspace, how would we get back to normal with commercial airliners coming in and still provide the level of security that our nation desperately needed at that point in time. But I'm happy to say that there are many, many layers of protection, many layers before you ever get to the point of having to scramble a fighter jet that has made not just our nation's capital more secure, but our entire national airspace more secure.
How did 9/11 change you?
It didn't change me at first because I was just doing my job. It didn't have to be me. It could have been any one of our fighter pilots standing there. I would love to think SAS chose me because I'm a great wingman, but I think he chose me because I didn't have kids and I didn't have a family. And although he has a gorgeous wife and wonderful kids, as a leader, he wasn't going to let anyone else take on that suicide mission either.
What was your dad's reaction?
As a dad, he was shocked, but as a fellow fighter pilot, he was proud.
How often do you think about that day?
I don't think 9/11 has ever really left any of us. It's fundamentally changed the entire way that we live as Americans. I don't go back to revisit the trauma. I think that's not helpful. I think fear, I think anger, I think sensationalism. I think that kind of adrenaline is not useful in our public life. It doesn't bring out the best of us. But one way that the legacy of 9/11, and specifically the passengers of Flight 93, has left with me is every day I get a chance to wake up and say, how can I make my world a better place? How can I take that spirit of service, of courage, into my community to make our nation a better place? And I think that's the real legacy of 9/11. Because when you talk with people, there is the fear, the trauma, it was something unlike what our nation had ever experienced. But the other thing that stands out when they talk to you are the stories of how ordinary people came together to help each other. The kindnesses of strangers, the compassion of neighbors that they previously didn't even know their name. That's the kind of America that we need to stay connected with. That's the true legacy. We say never forget, but I hope that we always remember the courage, the service, the community, the compassion that truly underlies what it means to be American and is at the spirit of our civil nation.
What do you say to young people today who didn't live through 9/11? It's kind of almost hard to believe that there's, living, thinking, walking adults who did not experience it. What's your message to them? What do you say to them?
They don't remember a world prior. I mean, 9/11 truly is a watershed moment because the universe wasn't the same afterwards. And although they weren't there at that moment, what's important for them is to understand that there are things in this world that are more important than our individual lives. That living in fear, living in terror, living with that sense of insecurity is not what's going to bring out the best of who they are, and it's not going to bring out the best of who we are as a nation. That instead, the real legacy that they are now charged with living forward to is understanding that there is nothing truly safe in this world, but nothing truly great ever happens in total safety. And so that they can make choices every day to be ordinary heroes, to live up to their greatness, and to contribute to who we are as a nation.
You're now a defense policy expert who advises our administrations on Air Force readiness, Air Force policy. What is your analysis of the current state of the readiness of our Air Force?
I worry that the 20 years that we've spent in the Middle East has caused us to lose the imagination of the existential threats that our nation faces, in a very similar way that we lost the imagination of what could possibly happen from the time of the Cold War to 9/11. The challenges that China is posing to our nation, to the whole global order, which we as the United States, as a superpower, crafted a rule of law, freedom of the commons, and global trade that has benefited the entire world. And that's now at risk because of China and because of Russia. But we have been strategically distracted over the last 20 years and complacent because until recently there has been no true military peer that could challenge us. But the challenge is that national security and military capabilities aren't something that you can flip a switch and make happen overnight. And so I have significant concerns that when it comes to being able to credibly shape, deter, and if necessary prevail in those kinds of peer existential conflicts, that we won't be ready.
Heather, Penney, thank you so much for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it.
It's been a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you.